This is BBC Two. Now, Newsnight with Kirsty Walk.
President Obama warns that Russia has returned to a Cold War mentality as he cancels talks in Moscow over the Snowden affair and condemns new anti-gay laws. And just a few weeks ago, he and President Putin seemed so happy together. Do we fundamentally misunderstand Russia? Does it long to be back in the USSR? We'll speak to guests in Moscow, Washington, New York, and here in the studio. Also tonight, the government promised broadband fast and furious, even to some of the most remote locations. But having pushed the target back, are they also putting the country's future prosperity at risk?
The future is about collaboration, and to do that, you need lots of bandwidth in both directions. So straight away, we need bi-directional broadband. We've invested fundamentally in the wrong technology.
Who has the ascendancy in Syria's long, bloody conflict? Tonight, there are claims of an attempt on President Assad's life.
His enemies may have had a bad start to the summer, but now there's evidence that things may be changing.
And back in May, the Conservative MP Jacob Rees-Mogg enjoyed a dinner as the guest speaker of a campaigning organisation called Traditional Britain. Now alerted to their views on immigration, he says he's shocked. I'll be asking why he felt the need to say so. Good evening. Do we really understand what makes Russia tick? Ever since the words glasnost and perestroika entered the lexicon, there was a belief that Russia would open up like a can of caviar and all the old paranoia and mistrust of the West would disappear. But now President Obama, incensed by the Snowden affair, has said that Russia has stepped back into a Cold War mentality. And as a result of the anti-gay law passed in the Duma, there are calls, prominent among them here from Stephen Fry, for a boycott of the Sochi Winter Olympics next year. However, a democratically elected parliament passed that law, and Vladimir Putin's approval ratings since the civil crackdown haven't nosedived. Here's Robin Denslow.
Vladimir Putin has again been clashing with critics inside Russia and abroad, while still revelling in his image of the hard man. Over the past 24 hours, he's scuppered plans for a proposed summit with President Obama by granting temporary asylum to the American whistleblower Edward Snowden, while Russia's new anti-gay legislation has led for calls for the country to be stripped of the forthcoming Winter Olympics. So what is Vladimir Putin's agenda?
Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin.
Relations with the US have been increasingly chilly ever since Putin returned to the Kremlin for his third term last year. The Russians were furious at America's Magnitsky Act, named in honor of a whistleblowing Moscow lawyer who died in jail in Moscow in 2009. It punished Russians accused of human rights violations by freezing their assets and denying them visas for the US. Obama and Putin last met at the G8 summit in June, but now comes Obama's cancellation of their one-to-one meeting in Moscow next month. The White House cited a lack of progress on issues from missile defense to trade, global security and human rights. Then, of course, there's the Snowden question. President Obama said he was disappointed by the Russian asylum decision, and last night he added,
"There have been times where they've slipped back into Cold War thinking and a Cold War mentality, and what I consistently say to President Putin is that's the past, and we've got to think about the future."
I think Putin has deliberately decided to poke Obama in the eye. Even before Snowden, this was not a happy relationship between the United States and Russia. Been a chapter of events which have deeply upset Putin. Maybe something went wrong when they met at the G8 summit in Northern Ireland. So this has been a deliberate act decided by the Kremlin. Don't believe any of that Russian stuff about low-level officials having taken the decision.
Putin's election campaign last year was marked by a series of mass protests in Moscow and other major cities. His reaction, according to Human Rights Watch, was to introduce curbs on public demonstrations and a wider definition of treason, what they described as the worst political crackdown in Russia's post-Soviet history. The pop group Pussy Riot became the international symbol of the protests after being arrested for performing an anti-Putin anthem in a Moscow cathedral. 2 band members are serving jail sentences in remote prison colonies for hooliganism motivated by religious hatred. They said they were highlighting links between the government and the Orthodox Church. In June, the Russian parliament approved a new law allowing jail sentences for offending religious feelings, along with another controversial new federal law banning gay propaganda aimed at minors, which also imposes fines on those holding gay pride rallies. It's already having an effect. This gay rights demonstration last week was broken up by paratroopers. Scenes like this, it's argued, help Putin maintain his power base.
I mean, his agenda, I think, really is to consolidate his power base, and he sees his power base as that conservative portion of the population that he can, by using these divisive issues, whether it's about gays or religion or NGOs or the United States or Snowden or what have you, he can drive a wedge between the positions taken by the liberal opposition, which are broadly cosmopolitan and liberal and Western looking, and sort of the core conservative traditional values, as he would couch them, of what he would see as his majority, Putin's majority.
But Russia's repressive new laws could have international implications. In February next year, the 22nd Winter Olympics are to be held in Sochi, a Russian city on the Black Sea. The Russian sports minister said today that while the rights of athletes competing will be respected, they would have to respect the laws of the country, including the anti-gay laws. The actor and writer Stephen Fry has called for Russia to be stripped of the Olympic event as a protest over the issue of gay rights.
An absolute ban on the Russian Winter Olympics of 2014 on Sochi is simply essential. It is simply not enough to say that gay Olympians may or may not be safe in their village. The IOC absolutely must take a firm stance.
Putin, a man who loves his macho image, doesn't seem to care. Russia is increasingly divided, but he's not worried by the liberals and the educated urban opposition. So long as well over half the country support him and his conservative nationalist agenda, as it seems they do, he clearly feels he can do what he wants.
Robin Denslow. Joining us from Washington, we have Julia Ioffe, a former Moscow correspondent for The New Yorker. From New York, the LGBT rights activist Nancy Goldstein. From Moscow, Ilya Ponomarev, a Russian opposition politician who leads protests against President Putin last year. And here in the studio, Alexander Nekrasov, a former Kremlin advisor. First of all, Ilya, this idea, particularly, let's just on the Snowden affair, that Putin is poking Obama in the eye is one thing. But on the anti-gay legislation, as Robin Denslow said in our film, this appeals to traditional Russian values. Would you say, actually, that he has Putinism? This is Putinism, and it has the backing of the majority of the Russian people.
No, you see, I think that both notions, the notion about Snowden and the notion about this anti-gay law and many other conservative pieces of legislation that were passed recently, they are all driven by internal politics. Putin badly needs to consolidate this conservative part of the society, which represents basically around 2/3 of Russian population, because his support base is deteriorating very rapidly recently, and without getting those guys together, without proving that he is the warrantor for the stability in the country and for these traditional Russian values indeed, without that he cannot preserve his power.
But Alexander Nekrasov, it is also, is it not, about distancing himself from the West, saying that Russia can be great again if we, it's the resurgence of the church and so forth. It is the clampdown, the whole Pussy Riot business. It is him saying that I stand for a particular kind of, as it were, conservative Russia.
Well, in a sense, yes. He has to respect the views of the people who live in Russia and not listen, to what the Western powers are saying to him.
But does that mean, I mean, we saw images there of young Russian children attacking gay protesters. I mean, is that what Russia, is that the future for Russia?
Well, first of all, this law has been misinterpreted, and I think there's a lot of confusion around it, because this law was about protecting the children and protecting their welfare.
From what, though? From what?
Any sort of propaganda, including any pornography or anything at all.
Let's be quite clear.
That is part of that law.
But the thrust of the law, it would appear, is that it is saying that the relations between people of the same sex cannot be discussed or represented in front of children. Now, if children get that sense, they'll get the sense that that in itself is wrong.
Just
that
like
gay relationships. Do you believe in Russia that gay relationships are wrong?
Do believe in Russia? No.
Yes. Do you believe in
No,
gay
I'm
relationships?
explaining to you about this law because we are getting confused by that law, and Mr. Fry got confused by it as well. Because it's about preventing children from having any information about heterosexual sex or gay sex, all of it together. So that was thrown out. You see, we are witnessing now that we're only sticking to one part of that law.
So, Nancy Goldstein, you've heard what Alexander Nekrasov says, that actually you've got the wrong end of the stick here, that this is not actually a piece of anti-gay legislation. It's protecting children from all sorts of things, including pornography.
Well, I would remind the gentleman that the children of Russia are standing there on the streets watching the police beat peaceful protesters bloody. So I don't think that that's the best influence on them either. And in fact, we're going to have a chance to see if the gentleman is correct about the interpretation of the law. Alexei Davidov, a Russian gay activist, stood on the steps of a library in Moscow and unfurled a banner that said homosexuality is normal. He's been the first person to be arrested and indicted under the new law, and we are watching his trial with great interest to see exactly how this law is going to be interpreted.
Let me put that to Alexander. Was it right to arrest him? I mean, homosexuality is normal. What is so provocative about saying that?
Well, I can't comment on on individual cases.
But do you agree with his arrest?
What I can say to our American guest is that her country supports countries like Saudi Arabia, where gays and lesbians are arrested, prosecuted, and even tortured. So, excuse me, we are missing a big point here. And also, let's go through all the countries, you know, in the Middle East and outside, who America supports and arms and gives money to.
Well, let me put that to
Nancy.
Nancy.
Them, why don't they ask them? Why don't they ask China?
Well, Nancy Joffe, let me bring in Nancy Joffe there, because you are, as it were, a Russian American. Do you think we, Julie, do you think we actually misunderstand what is happening in Russia, in the West? Do we actually understand the Russian psyche?
I don't think we're really misinterpreting it. I think one thing that we are missing here is that if you're a foreigner who is found to be guilty of propagating gay propaganda, which includes not talking about heterosexual sex, but saying that heterosexual relationships are equal to homosexual relationships, for saying things like homosexual relationships are normal. If a foreigner is convicted of doing that, a Russian faces jail time. A fine. A foreigner convicted of it faces potential jail time. And if we're talking about, if we're going to go the whataboutism route, and we're going to talk about China and Saudi Arabia, neither Saudi Arabia nor China pretend to be part of Europe. They're not party to any European conventions. They don't sit around talking about how they're an integral part of European culture and that they're part of the civilized world. Well, they say, we're China, we're going to do things our way, get out of our business. Russia tries to be part of the West, but then says, when it's convenient for Russia, says, no, get out. This is not something that we want in our country.
Now, you know, widening this out, what President Obama has said is that there's a kind of neo-Cold War going on here, that the distance between the West and Russia is becoming greater. Alexander Nekrasov, do you worry about that?
I worry about things when the American president goes on a chat show and talks things like that, on a comedy chat show. I think where he's wrong is that we will always have cycles, and we will always see politicians saying things, posturing, and so on. What I see from another side is that the economic ties and links are strengthening. Americans invest a lot of money into Russia. The British invest a lot of money. I can tell you, for example, if you compare Russia and America, who is more friendly to Britain, BP is being torn apart in America, whereas BP in Russia was given 20% of the biggest oil corporation in the world.
But isn't that the case, that the realpolitik of this is that there may be concerns over, you know, civil liberties, freedoms, rights for gay people, but in the end of the day, it's about hard cash, and you have people like BP who are presumably not going to pull out of Russia because they don't like what President Putin is doing on the kind of civil discourse?
You know, Putin always is very pragmatic, and he always divides the issues of civil rights and all this blah blah, like he wants to say, and real business. So of course, BP is more than welcome. Siemens, Da Vinci, any other Western corporations, they are more than welcome. And they appear to be the first who actually praise all Putin's wrongdoings against civil society in Russia. For example, the current CEO of British Petroleum, Bob Dudley, was the first one who praised imprisonment of Mikhail Khodorkovsky back in 2003 to gain more rights for his, that time, Tumen oil company to get more oil deposits in Russia. And that's very unfortunate. But in fact, of course, Putin's own business is all in the Western world. So what he wants to do is he wants to divide and conquer. He wants Russian society to drift apart from the Western society. But he wants his own team to be in the West.
But Julie, isn't the reality that these big economic and business ties will survive no matter the regime in Russia?
I wouldn't quite put it that way. First of all, when we're talking about the U.S., we greatly overestimate the economic ties. Russia is 20th place when it comes to trading partners with the U.S. There are plenty of other countries who are ahead of the pack. And, you know, we see that BP has scaled back its operations in Russia. BP had quite a hard time in Russia. A lot of companies do struggle with the endemic and unpredictable corruption in Russia, where corruption isn't just grease in the wheels of a bureaucratic system, but where the state actually comes to you and extorts you for money. And if we're talking about the Olympics, the place where there's the most corruption is Sochi and the projects going on around the Olympics to prepare the city.
Nancy Goldstein, on the
Also,
question, let me just bring in Nancy here though, on the question
of a
boycott, you're not going to get a boycott of Sochi, are you?
Well, in fact, if the International Olympic Committee follows its own charter, which says that it will act against discrimination of any kind regarding the Games, the IOC should move Sochi, and I'm sure that Vancouver and Utah would be happy for the business. But I just want to say, on the discussion of real politics, the rest of the world understands those politics too, and that's why we're not aiming at a target as small as the Kremlin's heart. We're aiming for its wallet. And people like NBC and Coca-Cola and Stolichnaya and Visa and Panasonic all understand the value of not just American consumers, and certainly not just American gay consumers, but decent people all over the Western world who are going to boycott their products if they continue, on the one hand, to espouse liberal politics and pro-gay policies within their corporations and support a dictator in terms of their actual corporate sponsorship of Sochi.
Thank you all very much indeed.